Hey BookTube. So we're on to shelf tour number 3. We're on the third shelf of my black bookcase from the top going down. And this third shelf here is mostly classics, and mostly classics of one kind, which you'll see right away is obvious. But first, I will go through the books that are in front of the books. I have this shelf in particular has a lot of books that are stacked up in front. That's going to be a common theme in my shelf tours because my shelves are big enough to double layer, and because I have so many books and not enough bookcases that I need to stack them up in front. So, and I like to organize them in a certain way. So I like having certain books together in certain, um, certain not so much a certain look, but just having certain books together. Though certain look does help. Anyways, so we're gonna go through some of the books that are stacked sideways. We start off with Quiet Flows It On by Shalakov. If you've been keeping up on my book hauls, you'll have noticed that this one is fairly new, so I just stacked this one on top. And then we go to a translation of Ivan Turgenev's Father and Sons. Turgenev? I don't know, but this is an older translation. This is translated with an introduction, or translated by Barbara Makanowski, and it's introduced by Alexandra Tolstoy. Fairly plain cover there, a lot of empty space. And then we come to a volume of Dostoevsky's short stories that includes Notes from Underground, White Nights, and The Dream of a Ridiculous Man, with selections from The House of Dead. And the translation is on the back here by Andrew R. McAndrew. Andrew R. McAndrew. That's quite the last name, or first name and last name. His last name is McAndrew, and his parents are like, you know what, let's just call him Andrew. It's destined. Destined to be that way. And then we have The Mill and the Floss by George Eliot. I have not read any George Eliot yet. And this is one I've been thinking about reading. I was just about to pick this up and read it seriously until I watched a video by Steve Donahue where he said this was one of the most boring books by George Eliot. And that put me off. Especially since that the print is fairly small in this edition. And it's almost 500 pages with small print. I don't know if I want to be in a boring book for that long. But I have been in boring books for a lot longer, so maybe I should just double down and read some George Eliot one of these days. And then now we come to the theme. The theme will be broken only a few times, but the theme is Penguin Classics. So lots of Penguin Classics on this shelf. So these are the books in front. We start off with Elizabeth Gaskell's North and South. North and South. This is also fairly new buy. Where am I going to put these? There we go. Then we come to Jane Austen's Persuasion. This is a bit of a battered, waterlogged edition. This one is a book that I actually have read on the shelf, and I'll comment on which books I actually have read and which ones I have not. This one I have read. I've read a lot of Jane Austen, not all of Jane Austen, but almost. And when I first read this one, it didn't really stick out a whole lot. It's very quiet compared to her other stories, though there is some striking, like a striking scene of not so much violence, but physical mishap. That does not happen to the main character, but does happen. That's fairly unusual in a Jane Austen story. So Persuasion. I need to reread it in order to get fully acquainted with how I actually think of the story. And then we have Fathers and Sons again, but in a different translation. This one's the Oxford edition. This is translated by Richard Freeborn. And then we have another Dostoevsky. This is Notes from Underground. This is the vintage edition, which is actually fairly nice. It's just this one story, and this is the Richard Pever and Larissa Volkonsky translation. So it's the P&V translation. This one I have not. I've been wanting to read Notes from Underground for a while, but I compared this translation, and then I also have a volume of selected works of existentialism, which this is considered one of the early texts of existentialism, and it had included a section from was it Magachuk or something, whatever his name is, and from his translation, and I quite liked his translation a lot better because I also made the mistake of reading an essay that tore the Pevier and Volkonsky translation apart of Notes from Underground, using the opening as an example, and I didn't like the opening of this one so much either. So here I am being extremely picky with my translation choice for this really short work. And just recently finally pulled the trigger and bought the Modern Library short story collection of Dostoevsky that includes the Magachuk, is translated by David Magachuk. I think it's Magachuk. And it includes his entire translation of Notes from Underground. So that's the edition that I'll be reading it in. And then we mostly have Penguin Classics for the rest of this front shelf. Believe it or not, we still have not gotten to the main shelf yet. We continue with Stendhal's Love. This is a strange work. It's not one of his well-known works, or at least, like, there's two major novels, but this is translated by Gilbert and Suzanne Sale, with an introduction by Jean Stewart and B.C.J.G. Knight. This person has 4 different acronyms in their name. B.C.J.G. and then the last name is Knight. That's wild. I've never seen that before. Anyways, this seems to be an autobiography or autobiographic portrait of his own obsession with a particular woman, and it's basically autofiction. Back when autofiction was not the author's Twitter feed. And then we have Montesquieu's Persian Letters. Montesquieu is famous mostly for his Spirit of the Laws, which we will be coming to in this shelf tour. Not this particular shelf, but this shelf tour. And this is This is a novel of his, or sort of a novel, as the back says, a sort of a novel. And this is translated by C.J. Betts. And it's written. A collection of letters written and received by 2 Persian travelers in Europe, but I don't think it's from actual travelers. Like they're made up, so it's fiction. And then we come to Diderot or Diderot. I still can't figure out his name. These are also fairly new. This is, at least for me on my shelves. This is The Nun, short work. This is Jacques the Fatalist. A little bit longer. Oh, I should say who the translators are. So The Nun is translated by Leonard Tancock. Jacques the Fatalist, translated by Michael Henry with an introduction and notes by Martin Hall. So translated by Michael Henry, and then notes and introduction by Michael Hall. And then we come to our last volume of Diderot. This is Rameau's Nephew and de Lambert's Dream. So 2 novellas in 1 small edition. I like that cover. And then this is translated with introductions by Leonard Tancock. And then the quote here on the top says, "I have been and still am angry at being mediocre." Don't we all relate to that? And then we come to some English classics. We come to Willa Cather's O Pioneer. O Pioneers. It's plural. I like that cover too. This one's more of a glossy Penguin Classic. Some Penguin Classics come glossy like that. Not entirely sure how to explain that quality difference, but nonetheless, there it is. Then we come to H.G. Wells' The Island of Dr. Moreau, with an introduction by Margaret Atwood. And I gotta say, The Penguin Classic volumes of H.G. Wells have some of the ugliest covers I've ever seen. Like, look at that cover. It's just a random stock photo of a bunch of images, and then we got like a wave in the background and a fairly ugly or grainy picture of a painting of a wave or whatever, some digital recreation. It's awful. This one I have read. I have read this edition, and yeah, it's a very strange work, because it's basically H.G. Wells' take on evolutionary theory and how that connects with humans. So basically, it's about a scientist who's Dr. Moreau, who's on an island doing illegal manipulations of animals to make them sentient, and it's about our characters being basically shipwrecked, not on the island or close enough, and yeah, it's very odd book, but it's also fairly one-dimensional, or at least I found it so when I first read it. And then we move on to a couple of John Steinbeck. John Steinbeck, we have Of Mice and Men. I've read this before. In this shelf, we'll come to the edition that I actually read it in. But I love this cover so much of just the individual volume that I had to buy this one, brand new. So, love that cover. If you know the story, then you'll see that cover and you'll recognize it. Or you at least recognize the scene that's from. And then To a God Unknown, also by Steinbeck. I like that cover too. Slim volume. This one I have not read, though it's one of his more early works. It says his second novel. So, and then we come to two Victorian classics. We come to Charles Dickens' The Pickwick Papers. A nice cover there of the. Well, a lot of Dickens' works actually came illustrated when they were first published, and so not every edition likes to include illustrations. Those illustrations, though, I think they should. Like, for example, there's an illustration there. And I like how Penguin Classics, their newer editions of Dickens books, they like to include at least one of those illustrations on the covers. So there's The Pickwick Papers. I've not read that one. And then we come to Tom Jones by Henry Fielding. So this is a 18th century novel, one of the more famous ones from that period. Yeah, 1749. So it's also a big chunkster. I don't think this one has any illustrations to it, but yeah, it's quite a long novel. Over 800 pages. This is an edition that usually I like to, if it's an English classic, I don't usually buy them used like this, but but there's certain books where I want the helping hand of an editor. So this is edited with an introduction by R.P.C. Mutter, 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 and he's got three acronyms, or not acronyms, three initials at the very beginning of his name here, or her name, whoever it is. And see, I usually like to, I think of Project Gutenberg and how I can get this for free online on my e-reader, but I want the guiding hand of an editor for these older books. And then I like the introduction. I always read those introductions. And then these ones include notes in the back. This one includes 30 pages of notes. So even if the notes are not needed, I still like having the notes there as to help me get the most of this novel as I read it. Some books I'm not so particular about that. For example, the Pickwick Papers, I'd be fine reading as an e-copy, but I picked this one up before I think I had my e-reader, so but it saved me a lot of money, so, picking up a lot of English classics on my Kindle, Project Gutenberg. And then we come to the books on top of the books on the main shelf. So we have books that were stacked sideways on the shelf, then we have books that were stacked in front of the books on the shelf, standing upright, and then now we have books that are slivered, jammed in on top between the books on the actual shelf and then the bookcase. So then we have just a short bunch of books here. We have Horace Walpole's the Castle of Otranto. I had to read this for a university class. I like that cover there, but the book itself is fairly unimpressive, or at least I didn't care for it. It was not very well written or anything like that. It's a Gothic, one of the early Gothic tales, and it's fairly short, but it's wild, as Gothic stories tend to be. But that's really all it is. It really doesn't have a lot more substance than that. And then we come to the only Dickens I've ever read. This is The Great Expectations, with the most boring Dickens cover you'll ever see. Yeah, just a shadowy ship in the harbor there. And I liked this book, but I wasn't enamored with it like so many people are with Dickens, especially with all the Dickens gimmicks that are on display in this book. And I haven't really felt the need to go back to him anytime soon, but I'd like to change that now. Maybe at the end of this year yet, I'll read another Dickens. And then we come to Henry Ibsen, A Doll's House and Other Plays. If you've watched my earlier 2 videos, you'll notice I didn't shelf 1. I had the Oxford edition of Henry Ibsen's plays, and so this is my second edition of Ibsen's plays. This is translated by Peter Watts. Does this not have an introduction? Usually yes, it does. It has a short introduction. I like that cover too. I'll put that one here. And then we come to Washington Irving, A History of New York. This is another one of those Penguin classics. Not with a glossy cover, but this one has like not a matted cover, but almost looks like it's a photocopied cover. Like the cover has a distinct lack of quality to it, and a lack of eye-popping color. I don't know if I could get an example here. Yeah, here's this edition, and you got this edition. You can't really see in the camera, but this one is a lot more faded and colored out. And this one here, you got the glossy up here, and then you got a matted finish here. But this one doesn't have that. This one is just matted all the way around. I actually bought this before I even really knew who Washington Irving was. It was an old book that I've heard about that looked interesting, and it's the Dutch historian Diederik Knickerbocker, which is Irving's satirical creation, where I believe he posted in the local newspapers this notice of this missing historian, Diederik Knickerbocker, which created a sensation of finding out who this guy was. And the back here actually says, in 1809, New Yorkers were buzzing about a series of classified ads concerning the whereabouts of Dutch historian Diederik Knickerbocker. But who was this Knickerbocker? Pure invention, the creation of Washington Irving to drum up interest in his first solo book, The History of Washington. Told from Knickerbocker's point of view, a history of New York is a chronicle of New York's 50 years under Dutch rule in the 1600s that plays fast and loose with the facts to uproarious effect. Irving's good-humored spoofing had staying power, and his satire provided the city with its first self-portrait. A History of New York propelled Irving to the heights of literary stardom and even made a little history of its own. New Yorkers are called Knickerbockers to this day. And if you look at even the basketball team, the New York Knicks comes from Knickerbocker. And so this is basically a satire. I'm already at 20 minutes and I haven't even gotten to the main shelf yet. Well, maybe we should go through it quickly then. But we have one more book. We have H.G. Wells' The Time Machine, and this one also a fairly ugly cover. Very slim thing. This one I have not read, but there's no excuse for not having read this thing because it's only 76 pages. So I should read this one. And then we get to the main shelf. So which way do I want to go? Let's go from left to right. We come to Cervantes' Don Quixote. This is translated with notes by John Rutherford. And first I'm going to say I have read this volume. I've read this volume of Don Quixote. In Shelf 1, you'll recall that we came to the Edith Grossman translation with the red volume with the knight on the faded knight on the front cover. I have not read that edition, but I've read this one. This is the John Rutherford translation, and I find it really interesting considering those two translations because this translation came out in the year 2000. It was a brand new translation for Penguin Classics, which is a big deal usually when a new translation of a major work comes out in Penguin Classics. So it's like this fresh new work, and of course this one has quote. I think this one has blurbs or something in it. Maybe not. I thought it did, but anyways. So you have this new translation, and then 3 years later, Edith Grossman comes out with another new translation of Don Quixote, and that one is the one that becomes the major bestseller, the one that everyone praises as capturing the humor of Cervantes, and it becomes a literary sensation on its own, much to the discredit almost of this translation, which is, from what I've heard, is considered good, but not Edith Grossman level, which is great, and so very interesting. The only staying power this translation has is that it's published in Penguin Classics. So you have people who've encountered this book since, though it has a different cover now. The Penguin Classic Rutherford translation has a different cover, but so I actually liked this translation. This one's pretty good. I thought it was quite funny, but the novel does tend to drag in some spots. And then we move on to R.D. Blackmore, Lorna Doone. Lorna Doone by R.D. Blackmore. This is another one of those glossy penguins. I don't know much about this novel other than it's basically a thriller novel from the 19th century. Yeah, 1869. So it's like a thriller novel from that period. I don't really know it's considered a romance. Not in the sense of like romance novels today, but in romances in like the fast-paced, chivalric, heroic tradition. At least that's my understanding. And his use of the word romance, but could be wrong. We'll see. And then we come to a battered edition, a Penguin edition of The Brothers Karamazov by Dostoevsky, or Karamazov as some people like to call it. And this is a battered edition that I found for dirt cheap at a thrift store at one point, and I've since read it, even when I found it at the thrift store, it has pages coming out, if you can see that there. These pages are already detached from the spine, and it's like 15 pages or so, and they're all still present. They're all still there, so they're not missing. But I found this for $1 used, and so I figured I'd read it. And so I have read this edition. This is the David Macduff translation, and I didn't really know what to make of it when I read it, because it's been quite a while since I've read it. I think I read it in 2020, the summer of 2020, and it took me quite a while to read, and it was very off and on, because this book has a lot of different registers to it, and I was trying to get acquainted with those, and so I'd really like to reread this at some point. Though I don't know when, because I'm currently reading another Dostoevsky, which is another reread, so we'll see. And we move on to another George Eliot novel. We have Middlemarch, which I gotta say, it's got one of the ugliest covers I've seen. That painting there and that whatever, it makes it look so boring. But I picked this edition up because it's Penguin Classics, and it's got notes. Does it have notes? Yes, it does. Notes and an introduction. And I always love having those notes and an introduction, plus the guiding hand of an editor. And I guess I should explain what I mean by the guiding hand of an editor. Editors usually pick which edition of the novel to use. So a novel like this, since its first printing, would have had many different editions. Like maybe there's typos in the very first edition that are corrected later on by the author, or maybe there's editions that come out later that are corrected not by the author, but after the author's death. Or maybe there's an edition that comes out by University Press as a volume in the definitive works of George Eliot. So they come out with, say, like, I don't know, 20 volumes of the collected works of the definitive works of George Eliot. And then they'll pick this novel, or pick that edition to print this novel in as, like, some definitive edition to go off of. And there's a whole bunch of textual and whatnot variations, and I don't know the history of the printing of this novel, but a lot of Victorian novels do have that kind of tradition, and I guess I could talk about it more too with another novel on this shelf. Well, I guess I can pull it out now, and we'll just skip to it. But for example, this edition here, I have Nathaniel Hawthorne's The Scarlet Letter, and this is the Oxford edition. And this is, I've read this edition, and it says, the text of this volume is taken from the centenary edition of Hawthorne's works, the most authoritative critical edition. That's the word I was missing, critical edition. So a critical edition, and you can have multiple critical editions, but this edition is basically a facsimile reprint of that critical edition, based off of certain scholars deciding this as the authoritative text to go off of, or however they decide to go about it. Like, what is it the closest to what Hawthorne wanted his novel to be? Is it full? Like, for example, was the first printing full of misprints and errors, and they corrected those, or is there some inconsistencies that they touch up on, or however they go about doing that? But this, and I believe this edition, like the centennial edition of Hawthorne's works, published by Ohio State University Press in the 60s. So that's an example of what I'm talking about here. When I grab a Penguin Classic, Oxford does it too. They try to look for authoritative, edited, scholarly texts of these works, and sorry, there's something in my throat. They look for the best edition of these texts, and something that you don't get in Project Gutenberg if they're just copying off of some random, I don't know, old edition from, I don't know, 1910 or something. Some hardcover from 1910 that's been put on the Internet Archives, and they're just transcribing it word for word. You can get a lot more errors that way than you could in a text like this, where it's a scholar who's devoting his time to choosing the right text and making corrections if need be, and trying to provide you with a clear and authoritative work. So that's why I choose like to choose certain English works in these editions. So we have William Thackeray's Vanity Fair, also with a great cover. Their cover has changed from the Penguin Classics. What is this illustration from? No, this is a painting. So I thought maybe this was illustrated. Thackeray, maybe it was illustrated. They just don't include them, which would be very annoying. But anyways, I'm at 30 minutes here, so I'm going to try and rush. So we got William Thackeray, Vanity Fair. I have not read that volume. And then we come to We by Yevgeny Zamyatin. Very distinct cover there, though I would say the cover does not really accurately represent the novel. I've read this novel, and this is translated with an introduction by Clarence Brown. And this is the dystopian novel from the 1920s that inspired George Orwell to write 1984. So George Orwell takes off of, well, he's clearly inspired by this novel, though the novels are quite different. 1984, I would consider to be the more interesting work, though this novel is probably constitutes the better story. It's a lot more funny too, which is something that I was quite surprised with, or pleasantly surprised with. So, very good novel. Very good dystopian novel, and quite short too. I need to reread this, especially since that there's been newer translations since this one has come out. Moving on to Bulgakov, The Master and Margarita. I also like that cover. This is translated by Richard Pever and Larissa Volkonsky. So this is their Pever and Volkonsky translation. I've not read this edition either, so another Russian classic that I need to get to. Then we come to Mary Shelley. This is Frankenstein, but it's the 1818 text. And I love that cover too, because it's an original cover illustration for this edition, not some stealing off of some painting or whatever. The cover illustration is by Marcy Washington, and it's the monster looking down at himself. And if you're not familiar, Frankenstein has two editions. 1818 is the edition that Mary Shelley wrote, or that she originally published when she was, 18 or 19 years old. And then in her 30s, in 1931, she revised the text. And she changed some things and added some other things. And there is a distinct difference in some of the storylines that appear in both. So, Penguin's regular Frankenstein, you've probably seen it. It's got some, like a nude man or whatever on the cover. And he's like turning towards you in a creepy way. That's the 1831 text, and that's the text that usually is reprinted by popular reprint houses, and so this one has to distinguish itself by being the 1818 text, and I quite like this. I prefer the 1818 edition, and I quite like the novel. Then we come to another novel that I've read. This is Matthew Lewis's The Monk. A very ugly cover, but it's a very appropriate cover for this novel. It's another gothic novel, maybe the most famous gothic novel, and certainly the most entertaining one. The story is about a Catholic monk who's super pious, who ends up committing a lot of sin, and it's Matthew Lewis basically laughing at him the entire time as this Catholic monk, because Matthew Lewis, who's in Protestant England, is laughing at the Catholics in this novel, and as this Catholic monk descends further into the pits of hell through his sin, and so it's a very well written novel, or at least, it's a very well written novel, very readable, and it's by far the most entertaining gothic novel that I've read. And then we come to E.M. Forster's Passage to India. Nice edition here. And I've not read any Forster, but this is his most famous novel. Need to get to that. And then we get to Robert Louis Stevenson, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde and Other Stories, or Other Tales of Terror. Sorry. And that cover is supposed to be like a photograph that's like on top of each other, where if you look closely enough, you can see there's some kind of creature with fangs. And I've read the title story here a long time ago. It's like 70 or 80 pages. It's very short, but it's high time that I've reread it, because I do remember it being a fun story, but I still consider the very ending to be anticlimactic, because the ending is basically just a whole chapter transcribing a letter that the title character Dr. Jekyll writes as a confession, and that's basically all we get as the after the major action of finding out the connection between Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and then we have this confession letter that just ends off the narrative. And I always found that anticlimactic, because it's rather boring just to have this dusty confession letter. But maybe I'm wrong. It's been a while. Then we come to Giles Dickens again. We've got David Copperfield with another one of those original illustrations for this book on the cover. And does this one have illustrations in it? Yes, it does. That's the only one I can find right now, but... oh, there it is. There's another one. And then we come to Tess of the D'Urbervilles by Thomas Hardy. This is one of the newer Penguin Classic designs, and I'm kind of disappointed by these new ones. I'm fine with that banner. It looks different, and I'm fine with all this stuff. But the image on here is different from the other image. They used to have a painting, which I thought was a lot more appropriate, and that image there doesn't really suit the book. Like when you read this book, you don't think of a photograph at all. You think of more of a picturesque country woman, really, and that's what the other image on the older edition gave. But then these editions also like to wear out on the spines here. Not as in terms of usage, though these do crack easier, these spines do, but just by holding the book, you're rubbing off all that black there, which is kind of annoying, especially on this shelf. When you see on the shelf, and you got these, see it's bordered by these white there. And then we come to Charlotte Perkins Gilman, the yellow wallpaper, Herland, and selected writings. I like that cover there. That's a really good cover. I think it's original too, yeah. Helene Delmar. It's from the famous title story here, The Yellow Wallpaper. And I've not read everything from here, but I've read the title short story and a few others from this selection here. And then Herland is like a novella, a feminist utopia novella. And then we come to Nathaniel Hawthorne again. This is The House of the Seven Gables. I quite like this novel, even though if you come to novels for an interesting or an intriguing plot, you won't totally get that here, because I found with this novel it was almost completely plotless. There is some plot in there, and there is some intrigue in it too, but not enough to really constitute a well-developed plot. What really saves the novel is, one, Hawthorne's writing, and two, his characters, which are really quite well portrayed, I've found. Then we come to Moby Dick. This is the Penguin Classic Deluxe Edition, and I've read this volume. I read this volume, was it last year? Yes, it was last year, I believe. Moby Dick. And I love the back illustration, just the eye of the whale. Moby Dick. Very good novel, very confusing novel, but it's well worth it to stick through the entire thing, I think. And I still don't know what to make of it exactly, but I want to reread it someday. And then we come to the Another Penguin Classic Deluxe Edition. This is the short novels of John Steinbeck. And this includes The Pearl, Cannery Row of Mice and Men, The Red Pony, The Moon at Dawn, or The Moon is Down, sorry, and then Tortilla Flat. And what's unique about this cover here is that each section here, where the title is on, is a section taken from the original first printing hardback cover of each novel. So Tortilla Flat, this little section here, is from the original cover, and same with every single other novella or short novel. This is the edition that I read of Mice and Men in originally, before I bought the individual volume. And then last but not least, on the shelf here at just over 40 minutes, we have Lew Wallace's Ben-Hur. And it's a beautiful edition. I love this edition. You see it's shiny, with a big shield, and it just goes all the way around here. Beautiful edition. And then the quote on the back says, "The horses are ready, I am ready, and thou?" But it has the French flaps with the French flaps with the deckled edges. And I was very excited to get this novel in this edition until I heard Steve Donahue say that this novel is completely flat. So I have a beautiful edition of a supposedly boring book. So I have not had the gall to pick it up and read it and test that hypothesis at this point. So that's it. That's for this shelf at 41 minutes. Good lord. Hopefully all the other ones don't take that long. So I'll check off now for the time being. Anyways, see you in book 2.